As Petey was wheeled over to the day room for breakfast, his mind raced. He knew what poison meant from the idle talk overheard in infant's ward, but he had no idea what poison looked like. The attendant's hard shakes of the sheet, however, made it clear the mice would not be tolerated. Waiting for food, Petey sat with his head angled sharply over to the left as if frozen at the end of the stretch. Somehow, he had to keep food off his sheet. Opening his mouth extra wide, he concentrated on each bite. Desperately, he curled his lips around the food. His enormous effort was not entirely successful. Choking and gagging on the trapped food, he finally wrenched his head sideways and spewed a mouthful all over the floor. Someone hit the attendant. "Knock that off," the man bellowed. "You act like you've never eaten before." Petey curled his lips inward and examined the sheet. Though still hungry, he decided not to push his luck. He closed his mouth to the next bite and shook his head back and forth. "Okay, suits me," the attendant declared, shoving back from the table. All morning, Petey tried to communicate his problem to Calvin, but the concept was too complicated. What gestures explained rat poison or mouse droppings? Finally, he gave up in hopeless despair and ignored Calvin's probing questions. Calvin rolled away to a different window. By supper, Petey was so hungry he had to eat something. Twice, his coughing spells sprayed food in every direction. After the meal, he inspected his sheet. Several large food bits lay scattered near his waist. He flung his arms and twisted his body. The food bits moved, but fell against his legs, where he could force no motion. All evening, he started down at each one representing death to his tiny friends. When at last the attendant lifted him onto his bed for the night, Petey was exhausted. The day's efforts only made the upcoming vigil for more torturous. As the light switched off, Petey was in the dark for any sound of his friends. Once a faint shuffle surrounded on the hard floor, and Petey confused his body. The sound disappeared. When the furnace first kicked on, he saw William nosing his whiskers over the edge of the chair. Petey failed his arms wildly and watched his friend scamper away. 3 more times during the night he grunted and struggled against the sounds from the darkness. Finally, Petey could no longer keep his eyes upon it and submitted his weariness. He slept until the furnace roared to life and jarred him awake. Skimming his eyes back and forth across the sheet, Petey sighed with relief. He spotted no movement. Then he looked down in horror. A little furry pile had curled up next to his leg. Esteban. Petey watched the small mouse for several long minutes. Esteban cuddled closer and tucked his teeny nose, snuggling between his feet. Twice Petey tried to strike out at his friend, but his body froze and refused the act. Esteban trusted him and would not understand this act of betrayal. Petey's feelings tore at his conscience. Any further stillness condemned Esteban to death. Finally, with a sudden jerk, Petey closed his eyes and brought his arms crashing against his leg near where the little mouse slept. Esteban scrambled frantically out of his cozy nest as Petey's arms pummeled him, sending him tumbling to the floor. Petey let out a pinched cry and continued flailing his bent arms in a frenzy. He kept his eyes closed. One but awake, Calvin had awakened to find Petey lashing out at the mouse that so often cuddled near his side. Even the little mouse hit the floor and scurried away.
Calvin watched Petey whip his arms up and down, eyes closed tightly in a grimace. The next morning, wake up call, a sentry, leaving Petey of duty, light snow flecked
against the dirty window panes. Petey was glad not having to get up. Before he closed his eyes to sleep again, he looked over at the large melting droplets creeping their way down the glass. They were huge teardrops that refused to stop. The bright ceiling lights and the attendant's grating voice kept clawing Petey rudely from his sleep.
His body felt heavy with fatigue and retreated back into a super slumber. The rough shake of a hand
jarred Petey. "Hey, guy, join the living." Petey stared morosely at the attendant as the attendant slipped his blanket off and rolled him over for cleaning. All day, Petey heard no mention of the mice or poison, but he knew all the attendants needed was a reminder.
Except at feeding time. Petey slept soundly in his chair. Calvin tried unsuccessfully to ask Petey about his actions the night before. Petey closed his eyes too exhausted to answer. The bed lamp rising from the warm blanket, his sleep, and not until supper did Petey open his eyes and gaze dully about the room.
Patients moved past, conducting themselves with their usual confusing movements and unknown intentions. Calvin sat across the ward, staring into space. Petey watched him, wishing somehow he could explain the problem. Finally, Calvin broke from his fixed gaze and turned to look. Petey smiled to show friendship. Hesitantly, Calvin wheeled himself across the ward. "Hey, Petey, are you awake?" he asked as he came near. Aye. Why are you mad at me?" Ooh. You mean you ain't mad at me?" "Ooh. Then how come you wouldn't talk to me this morning? And why did you chase the mouse off in your bed last night? And why did you sleep all day?" Petey looked back at Calvin with a helpless stare. His eyes pleaded for questions he could answer. "I know you can't tell me," Calvin reminded himself. "Not unless I can guess, huh?" Petey nodded. For several minutes they regarded each other before Calvin spoke.
"Okay then, let me try." He wrinkled his forehead and puzzled his little club feet, strained and forward inward, as if to aid the effort. "Did ya hit the mouse 'cause he did something to it? To you?" "Ooh. Were you mad at him?" "Ooh. Then why did ya swing at the mouse?" Petey gave Calvin a look of reproach. Okay. Were ya helping the mouse?" Petey broke into a smile. Ee. "Petey, you're screwy. You don't
help a mouse by hitting it." Petey nodded his head instantly. "Petey, I don't understand." Again, Calvin sat puzzling for some time before he spoke again. "Were you trying to chase it away?" Petey nodded. "Were you trying to help the mouse by chasing it away?" Aye. "That don't make sense." Petey sat helpless. "Was something going to hurt the mouse?" Calvin ventured. Petey nodded his head eagerly. Aye. What was going to hurt him?" Petey stared. "Was it someone?" "Aye." "Who?" Petey frowned and shifted his eyes over toward the nurse's station. "They were going to hurt the mice? The attendants?" "Aye. How could they hurt the mice?" How could they hurt the mice? Petey could only stare at Calvin. Were they going to put out mouse traps? Petey thought for a moment.
Calvin almost had the answer in hand. If he said no, Calvin might give up, and they would never again return within reach of the proper answer. But Petey trusted in Calvin's persistence and felt certain he would not give up. Petey bet everything on his reply. Ooh, ooh. You mean they were going to hurt the mice, but they weren't going to set mouse traps? Aye. Petey, you're really screwy. They can't hurt mice if they don't set mouse traps. Now Petey worried. Maybe Calvin didn't know about poison. He looked at Calvin with a pleading look, begging him to keep trying. How else can they hurt the mice, Petey? Petey waited silently. Calvin bit at his lip and scratched both sides of his head. Finally, he threw his arms up. I don't know, maybe with poison. Petey jerked his arms wildly. His face lit up with a smile, and he squealed his answer. Aye, aye, aye. They're going to use poison? They said that? Aye. Petey jerked his chin up and down. His excitement went beyond the poison. Today he had successfully communicated a thought. He had broken through the invincible barrier guarding his mind.